Welcome back to another episode of Swamp Stories. For this episode, we cover an important story that many people don't know about. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. You can also follow the Instagram page as well. So let's get into it. The story begins in the 1950s. At this time, Chicago was the fastest growing city in America. The city had opened thousands of factories all over, from manufacturing, printing, steel, meatpacking, cattle, and so much more. Hundreds of thousands of tough blue-collar jobs opened up, and that meant that just as many immigrants came to Chicago. They mostly came from Poland, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. So because these families came over with nothing, they moved into Chicago's roughest neighborhoods. And for this video, we focus on the city's northwest side. By 1960, the northwest side was one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Chicago. It was pretty evenly divided between Eastern Europeans and Latin Americans, both having the same tough blue-collar jobs. All these families wanted was to earn a living and have their children eventually go to college. Well, early on, the area didn't have any underground activities whatsoever. And that takes us down Division Street. Just east of West Town, you have a housing project called the Cabrini Green. And starting in 1961, a group called the Disciples started controlling the project. From there, the Disciples started to spread all over the north side. By 1966, most of the north side was controlled by the Disciples. They were the coolest thing going, fearless, tough, and getting money in unorthodox ways. That's the north side, so you might be wondering what this has to do with the northwest. Well, in 1965, the city combined the north and northwest side into one school district. This meant that all the kids from the Cabrini Green began attending Wells High School in the West Town area. Over the next few years, the kids from the Cabrini Green began influencing the kids from the northwest. The concept of the Disciples was brand new to them, and at the time it was a brotherhood that all the cool kids wanted to be a part of. So the Northwest teenagers wanted to join in. We want to be disciples too. At this time, the Latin Kings had already been in existence, located in the Humboldt Park area. But the Kings had already been around for over a decade, so they weren't the coolest thing going anymore. So in late 1966, the Northwest students officially asked the Cabrini Green students if they could join the Disciples. At first, the answer was no, but after second thought, the Disciples figured that expansion wasn't a bad idea. So they granted them rights to start their own section of Disciples, the Latin Disciples. They agreed to establish themselves on the corner of Rockwell and Potomac because that's where a young man named Albert Hernandez lived. Albert was the main person who put everything in order. He was truly a natural-born leader, and he set the trend for other disciples to form in the Northwest. After him, the Bruce Lee Latin Disciples formed just 2 blocks down on the corner of Rockwell and Crystal. These guys were led by a young man named Pete Correa, also known as the Burner. Then lastly, a young man named Jose Cedeno, also known as Freckles, started the Almighty Latin Disciples. All 3 of these Latin Disciples sections formed right in the heart of the Kings' territory. So naturally, the Kings felt disrespected and started an instant rivalry. However, at this time, things were not that serious. Everyone involved were teenagers, so the farthest it got was a scuffle here and there. The 2 sides truly respected each other, especially given that all their families had just come from different countries to start new, meaning that they could all relate to each other's situation and often helped each other out when need be. The Chicago Blizzard. On January 26th and 27th of 1967, a massive blizzard ripped through Chicago. 15 degrees, 53-mile-per-hour winds, and 23 inches of snow. The storm destroyed many roofs, decks, and cars throughout the city. So together, the Latin Kings and Latin Disciples shoveled the snow away to get the neighborhood back going. They helped each other out, and this was a true sign of how respectful the early rivalry was. Open recruitment. In 1968, Albert Hernandez wanted to expand as big as he could. So to do this, he began recruiting members of all backgrounds. Dozens of German, Mexican, and Polish residents joined the previously Puerto Rican Latin Disciples. So by 1969, there were over 300 Latin Disciples. Albert Hernandez was running the Latin Disciples to be the biggest group in all of Chicago. He was even known to study dictators to learn how to dominate a society. And one of the qualities he learned is charisma. You need people to like you. So with this, he started making friends outside of the disciples. In 1970, he built a tight relationship with the Spanish Cobras, located in the Bridgeport homes on the south side. This relationship will later be relevant, but for now, we head to 1972. At this point, the disciples and Kings are not seeing eye to eye. Over the past few years, there were several incidents, but no one fell victim on either side. But unfortunately, that would change. January 18th, 1972. A few Polish Latin disciples are hanging out on the corner of Rockwell and Potomac. That's when a group of Latin Kings walk down to the corner. They start pestering the disciples and try to kick them off their corner. While in his mom's house on the corner, Albert hears all the commotion outside, so he quickly runs outside to stand up for his guys. But unfortunately, the Kings brought more than their bare hands. This was the very first incident that started everything on the northwest side. Albert was truly loved by all the 300 plus Latin disciples, so after he passed away, they started referring to him as King Albert. But actually, before all that, the disciples knew that they needed revenge. At this time, respect and dignity were still being followed. That meant that the Latin disciples had to find out exactly who did it before they could get back. And just a month later, they found out who it was. February 15th, 1972. The Latin disciples head over to North Mozart Street, where the man they believe did it lives. They wait in their car until he and his friend come outside. From here on, things got completely out of control, and all the members knew this. The Latin Kings had structure, and without Albert, the disciples knew that they would lose. They quickly decided that structure needed to be implemented, so they began calling top members princes, and all of the Latin disciples had to follow the prince's orders. In the summer of 1972, they appointed Prince Diablo as their main leader. He led the Latin disciples while Pete Correa led Bruce Lee. However, in February of 1973, Pete Correa went down, and this would be monumental, but not for the reason you would expect. After his arrest, Pete Correa either jumped out of or was thrown out of the police station window. And at his trial, he stood up while the judge was speaking and started screaming his lungs out. He yelled that he's a maniac and started swearing at the judge. It may seem like a small deal, but because of him, this wild reputation stuck with the Latin disciples. So much so that everyone, including themselves, began calling them the maniac Latin disciples. And this reputation led them to taking over much of the Latin Kings' West Humboldt territory. Many will argue whether this is true or not, but by documented accounts, the disciples took over the Kings during the mid-1970s. And by this time, the entire city of Chicago was out of control. The former blue-collar, hard-working areas were now some of the most dangerous streets you can imagine. In 1965, the city had a homicide rate of 11.5 per 100,000. And 8 years later, in 1973, it had more than doubled to 26.1. This was bad news, and the entire city knew it. So during the 1970s, nearly 400,000 residents left the city for the safe suburbs. This left tons of abandoned houses and storefronts across the city's poorest neighborhoods. The streets had successfully taken over the city of Chicago, and the maniac Latin disciples had a big part in that. Well, let's fast forward to 1975. This is when they appointed their two new leaders, Ramon Vasquez, also known as Prince Chichi, and Jose Cedeno, also known as Prince Freckles. Together, these two were like Shaq and Kobe. Rumors say that they were generating hundreds and hundreds of thousands per year, and in the 1970s, this was life-changing money. However, they weren't the only ones getting money on the northwest side, and that takes us to their main competition. Located in the Wicker Park neighborhood, a new group formed in the early 1970s. That would be the Insane Unknowns, and these guys were completely nuts. Their main mission was to take out any leader who they saw as competition. It didn't matter if they had history or not, the Insane Unknowns wanted to build a wild reputation early on. Specifically, a young member named Miguel Vasquez, who was only a freshman in high school. Well, in August of 1978, Miguel was on a mission to make a name for himself. August 14th, 1978, Miguel Vasquez drives around the Latin Disciples area, and on the corner of Rockwell and Potomac, he spots a valuable man, Prince Chichi, the leader of the Maniacs. So Miguel walks up to him, and without hesitation, bam! This incident shook up the Maniac Latin Disciples. This was their second leader gone, both in the exact same location. Except this time, nobody knew what this was about. At first, they thought that it was the Latin Kings, but they straight up denied doing it. None of this made any sense. That was until Miguel was caught by Chicago PD. In his court case, it was discovered that Miguel was a young member of the Insane Unknowns, and instantly this sparked a new rivalry. The Maniac Latin Disciples versus the Insane Unknowns. Well, somehow Miguel was only sentenced to 4 years for this. During these 4 years, in order to commemorate Prince Chichi, they appointed his best friend Fernando Zayas as the leader. He became known as Prince Fernie, and all he cared about was Miguel Vasquez. He even got a big RIP Chichi tattoo on his hand. That may seem typical today, but in 1978, a hand tattoo was unheard of. Well, Fernie knew that he needed to wait 4 years, but he was patient. And that takes us to 1983. Miguel Vasquez gets out of juvenile detention and word spreads around Northwest Chicago. The first weekend of his release, the Insane Unknowns throw him a big party. Well, Prince Fernie gets word of this and he instantly gets angry. So he meets up with his right-hand man, Jose Baby Rodriguez. They take Jose's sister's car without her knowing and head up to the party's location. That would be way up north in the Andersonville neighborhood. This is an upscale neighborhood where you can usually lay low, but that's hard to do when the Latin Disciples want you. July 1st, 1 a.m. Jose and Fernie arrive at the party location, 438 West Catalpa Street. There they see Miguel Vasquez watching an outdoor TV with his friends. So Fernie angrily gets out of his car and approaches. Bam! For a month after this, Prince Fernie and the Maniac Latin Disciples assumed that they had gotten away with this. But later that next month, some Insane Unknowns came forward as witnesses. Long story short, Prince Fernie got double life. However, this didn't stop him from continuing as a prince. In fact, it actually elevated his rank. From the moment he did what he did, he instantly gained eternal respect from all the Latin Disciples. So they allowed him to run the organization from inside Stateville Correctional Facility. Prince Fernie made it his mission to expand as big as possible. As a result, the Latin Disciples took over Bucktown, Hermosa, North Center, Gage Park, Irving Park, and Avondale. That was definitely a lot of information, but unfortunately, it's only going to get more complicated. Let's jump ahead to 1987. If you remember at the beginning, the Latin Disciples and Spanish Cobras were close allies. But this was a new generation and all the OGs were gone, both in Stateville and in cemeteries. The younger generations on both sides had zero care for any old truce or alliance. The Spanish Cobras versus the Maniac Latin Disciples. It all started at Wells High School, where the Cobras and Disciples got into a scuffle. And from that moment, it was all bad. This was the very first folk-on-folk rivalry in North and West Chicago. And this caused further divides, with the Imperial gangsters taking sides with the Cobras. So essentially, the late 1980s consisted of the Maniac Latin Disciples against the Latin Kings, Spanish Cobras, Imperial gangsters, and Insane Unknowns. The Latin Disciples were truly the real EBK of Chicago. Over the next few years, there were countless incidents in every direction, and it got to the point where a truce was needed. Truce attempt number 1. The Latin Disciples and Spanish Cobras decided that enough was enough. So they set up a meeting and called everything off. They even repaired their relationship and started getting money together like the old days. And this was a lethal mistake. In April of 1992, the Latin Disciples accused a Cobra member named Orlando of selling them fake product. So the next day, they claimed his life. Well, it's safe to say that the truce was done, and because of this, the Cobras did an unforgivable deed. They joined together with the Insane Unknowns. On top of this, they began calling themselves the Insane Cobras. In response, the Maniac Latin Disciples did their own clicking up. They joined together with the Milwaukee Kings and the Latin Lovers. Altogether, they were the Maniacs, and the other side were the Insanes. I know that all of this sounds silly, but there were actually serious consequences behind this. Every single day was chaotic in Northwest Chicago. You had to be extremely careful which streets you go down, because those could be the last streets you ever go down. It once again got to the point where the elders in the community demanded peace amongst the youth. So in February of 1994, they all got together. Truce attempt number 2. Roberto Clemente High School, 3 p.m. After school lets out, both sides decide to meet up. The Maniacs and Insanes stand in front of each other to talk it out. That's when a Campbell Boys member shows the Maniacs his hand. specifically a Latin Disciples member named Nelson Vargas, also known as Wolfie. A month prior, Wolfie had broken the Campbell boy's hand in multiple places, leaving it completely destroyed. So the Campbell boy puts his hand in his face and says, "Look what you did to me." Instantly, Wolfie breaks down laughing at the depressed Campbell member. So this takes him over the edge. He looks Wolfie in his eyes and bam! Everyone stood around in shock, but more so because they couldn't believe how disrespectful Wolfie was being. He really brought this upon himself for no reason. So of course, this broke the truce before it even started. After this, 1994 to 1999 were just as bad as any previous decade. But before we jump ahead, one incident stands out more than any other. May 21st, 1997. 4 maniac Latin disciples are leaving a bar together in the Hermosa neighborhood. They walk down to George Street to get back to their car, but that's where a rival is waiting for them. Bam! Directly after the incident, one of their fellow disciples named Jamie Hua drives around to see what happened. By the time he arrives, the police are already there, and because he's the only person around, they arrest Jamie for what had happened. Little did they know, Jamie lived in the area and the two guys were his close friends. Somehow though, Jamie received a double life sentence even though he had nothing to do with this. He didn't even have a tool in his possession, first of all, and who in their right mind would return to the scene after doing that? None of it made sense. However, it took the Illinois courts 21 years to reverse his convictions. I have to admit that sometimes I roll my eyes when people say the system is stacked against them, but then I hear stories like this and realize that all of that is real. In some cases, trouble can be inescapable, especially when the system isn't playing fair. And that takes us to 1999. Truce attempt number 3. In March of 1999, the Spanish Cobras and Maniac Latin Disciples decided that finally enough was enough. This rivalry needed to stop now, so they organized a meeting at the YMCA on North Lawndale Avenue. All of the maniacs and insanes show up as well. They all sit down in a circle in the gym. A discussion starts and the leaders agree once and for all that the rivalry is done. So the leaders all stand up and shake each other's hands to finally end this for good. Boom! That's when some guys kick down the door. 2 maniac Latin disciples run inside the gym and begin screaming, "No peace, F the insanes and F the Cobras." So everyone on both sides start running for the exits. However, the Cobra's leader Carlito runs down a dead-end hallway, and that's where a Latin disciple named Thomas Outlaw Ross corners him. Carlito turns around and begs him to relax, but Thomas doesn't care. Bam! This frustrated the whole community and they lost hope. They thought to themselves that this awful rivalry will never end. And that takes us to the 21st century. The 2000s have represented major change for the northwest side of Chicago. Some call it gentrification and others call it neighborhood improvements. Either way, the neighborhood is completely different than it used to be. According to locals, starting in the early 2000s, the hipsters took over. That meant that luxury apartments and condos were built all over. So because of this, many of the original families have moved out to lower end suburbs like Cicero or Oak Park. Today, the neighborhood's demographics are 27% Latino, down from 60% in 1990. So it's safe to say that the Latin Disciples and Spanish Cobras have less of a presence than they used to. However, as many families moved outside of Chicago, they brought their alliances with them. The Maniac Latin Disciples have a strong presence in Wisconsin, Indiana, Texas, and Miami. In fact, in 2016, 26 Latin Disciples went down in a Milwaukee indictment. But for now, let's focus on the current generation that's left in Chicago. Currently, the Maniac Latin Disciples have at least 15 sections throughout Chicago, but none are more active than a section called Grand City. These guys are located on the corner of West Grand and North Springfield on the west side. Locals will tell you to avoid this area at all costs. This is worse than 63rd. Well, Grand City is represented by a rapper named LV the God. He blew up in 2016 with a bunch of songs with millions of views. One of them has nearly 9 million views. Well, Grand City is rivals with the Cobras and Kings, but that's not even their biggest problem. Instead, they have had issues with fellow Maniac Latin Disciples. February 10th, 2015. A Grand City member named Jeremiah Neves, also known as Speedy, texts a fellow MLD named Jose Ruiz. He tells him to meet up with him to fight it out and then hang out and get food after. Recently, the two had gotten into it on Facebook, so this was a peace offering. At least that's what Jose thought. 4 p.m. They meet up at the El Taconazo restaurant. Speedy allegedly directs him behind the restaurant. And as they're ready to throw hands, bam! Speedy instantly went down for this, and LV the God would start a Free Speedy campaign, and eventually all charges would be dropped after lack of witnesses. Chicago investigators had all the messages on Facebook and camera surveillance as well. However, they needed a witness and no one came forward. But after getting out, things wouldn't be all good for Speedy, so let me set the context. Located on the corner of Albany and School, there's a section called Pee Wee City, and these guys have a wild reputation. They also happen to be maniac Latin disciples, but they are not fans of Speedy to say the least. And that takes us to September 22nd, 2020. Speedy and his girlfriend are at a bus stop on the 2500 block of North Maplewood, and that's when an alleged Pee-wee named Alexander Santander walks up to the two. He looks at Speedy and says, "What's up?" And before Speedy can even respond, bam! This incident was a big deal in the Maniac Latin Disciples community. Recently, LV the God released a song called Long Live Speedy. I honestly have no clue why he's not popping right now. His music is hard, especially this song, so definitely go check his music out. Well, after all this, all I can say is wow. The Maniac Latin Disciples are wild, and I don't know the solution to this madness. Things in Chicago seem like they start for the smallest reasons. It's really a whole different environment out there. But that's gonna do it for this episode of Swamp Stories. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace!